Hey, good morning and welcome to Reflections from the Road, a coffee talk style conversation this morning with friends to share what we've learned from the Heartland Together Listening Tour. A warm welcome to everyone joining us via live stream this morning. We are so glad that you are here. My name is Dennis Clary. I am the Director of Custom Civic Engagement here at the Kansas Leadership Center. A little bit more about civic engagement in just a second, but first, a little bit about the tour. In March and April of this year, members of the Kansas Leadership Center launched the Heartland Together Listening Tour in partnership with the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation, really to discover what challenges and opportunities communities face in terms of entrepreneurship and maybe more specifically, entrepreneurial ecosystem building. Today, we've gathered a few members of the team to reflect on that tour and share our relevant insights, thoughts, and the discussions we had across Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, and Iowa. First and foremost, just a note of gratitude, certainly to the Kauffman Foundation, without whom we wouldn't have been able to execute this work and all the learnings that we gained from it. And certainly also a note of gratitude to our friends at Network Kansas, who were critical in helping us establish not only a network, but really building relationships across the 4 states in which we conducted this tour. For those that may be joining us this morning that don't really have any familiarity with the Kansas Leadership Center, just a brief note on who we are and what we do. We are a first of a kind nonprofit educational institution. We have a civic mission, a national reputation, and a global reach, something we are very proud to have built over the last 15 years. We were founded in 2007 to foster leadership for stronger, healthier, more prosperous communities. In short, we teach people how to exercise leadership to make progress on the things they care about the most. So why are we here this morning specifically? Well, first and foremost, we're really here to celebrate the communities and their contributions to this initiative and what made it so powerful. You heard me say our purpose is for stronger, healthier communities. And there was really no better way to explore how communities are going about that than this listening tour. In recent years, to sort of attain our mission of healthier communities, we have increased our resources, our investment here at the Leadership Center in what we call civic engagement efforts. You can think of that broadly as people exercising leadership on a very specific issue of public concern, getting in the arena, so to speak. And in today's case, that issue is entrepreneurship, all things, and specifically entrepreneurial ecosystem building. And we hope that throughout today's discussion, we get to explore what kind of leadership is necessary to cultivate thriving entrepreneurial communities. And again, we're so glad that you joined us for the conversation. As a point of logistics this morning, if you have any questions that you want to chime in, please use the chat function on whatever respective platform you might be doing, whether that's Facebook or YouTube. And we'll touch in with our communications director, Sam Smith, throughout the conversation to see what's happening on the chat. So, okay, let's get to it. We have a lot of content to share with you this morning and a great conversation to be had. So I do want to introduce my esteemed friends and colleagues joining me this morning. For us, this is also very exciting because we really haven't had an opportunity to debrief with this group collectively what transpired just a couple short months ago. I'm going to introduce them by geography, the state that they spent some time touring. And first, we have Claudia Amaro. She's a teacher here at the KLC. Good morning, Claudia. Also joining us is Brandon Cleaver. He's the associate professor at the Staley School of Leadership Studies at Kansas State University, and really by extension, another member of our civic engagement team. Good morning, Brandon. Raquel Thiessen is joining us this morning. She's the director of community partnerships, and she spent her time across communities in Missouri. Good morning, Raquel. Our duo that spent some time in Iowa, we have Damon Young, our Chief Business Officer here at the Leadership Center. Good morning, Damon. And Lucy Petrusheva, she is a Civic Engagement Manager here at the Leadership Center. Last, certainly but not least, Alejandro Arias Esparza. He spent time in Nebraska. Good morning, Alejandro. Okay, let's get this going. Lucy, I'm going to start with you. You serve as the project manager for Heartland Together. Could you just set the stage for this morning's conversation and give us a brief overview of what the tour was, why we went on it, and who we visited, by the numbers, so to speak. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Lucy.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Dennis. And good morning, everyone. Like Dennis mentioned, I'm the project manager for this project. And I'll run through a few kind of overview remarks, and excuse me if I say anything that Dennis already shared. I might just repeat a few things. So let's manage my two screens here. So in the fall of 2021, the Kansas Leadership Center and Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation launched a project that we call the Heartland Together Project, a partnership to encourage local business growth in communities across the American heartland. And when we say that, we mean the 4-state region: Kansas, Missouri, Iowa, and Nebraska. And as Dennis mentioned, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, KLC's mission is to foster stronger, healthier, and more prosperous communities and serve the common good. And the Kauffman Foundation's mission is to help individuals attain economic independence by advancing educational achievement and entrepreneurial success. So together, we believe, next slide. We believe that if communities can encourage and support local entrepreneurship activities and new ventures, they're going to see growth in their economies, the launch, expansion, and retention of new companies, new residents over time, expanded civic capacity, stronger community identity, and more community resilience. And very importantly, we believe that building the support structure or ecosystem around entrepreneurs requires many stakeholders in a community coming together. So it's business owners and entrepreneurs and entrepreneur support organizations and chambers, but it's also schools that develop entrepreneurs and artists and all sorts of people in the community that create the conditions for entrepreneurs to be able to thrive. So we wanted to go on a tour to learn about how to better support communities to do this work. So we went to the communities that you see listed here. And really, we were seeking to hear from communities with a range in location, population size, and diversity, and entrepreneurial activity. And we chose these communities based on recommendations from experts in the economic development field, and because each of these communities had a community host that sort of raised their hand and applied to host a local listening session. Our participants were community members from all backgrounds and vocations. So entrepreneurs, economic development experts, city council members, chamber directors, pastors, community organizers, just individuals who care about the community and represent different points of view. The sessions were facilitated by KLC facilitators. They lasted about an hour and a half, and they focused on these questions. So when you think about the future of entrepreneurship in your community, what concerns you the most? What aspirations do you have? And then what makes it difficult to bridge this gap? Those were some of the questions we focused on. So in total, we had 23 listening sessions, 18 in Spanish, 18 in English, and 5 in Spanish. We went into this kind of knowing that you can't really engage in building a robust support structure for entrepreneurs if you aren't hearing from diverse community members. Maybe people who aren't usually involved in this type of conversation, but are certainly part of the community system. So that was a big focus for us. And we had a total of 358 participants engaged, and on average, about 16 participants per session. So one more slide here. Our discussion today we'll focus on a few things. So we're going to be talking about regional, not community-based themes. So because we were hoping to develop interventions on a regional scale, we wanted to capture themes on a regional scale. And our focus at this stage was not going deep into the themes of each community, but rather regionally. We'll be talking about challenges and aspirations, not necessarily solutions. So at this point, we're also not providing solutions to business challenges. Rather, we're trying to surface those challenges, inspect them, unpack them, and ultimately design and experiment solutions for them. And then inevitably, the thing probably our team is most excited about is just sharing with you the kinds of experiences we had on the tour and what we saw and how we felt. So I think that's everything I have to share to kind of set the ground.
Lucy, thank you very much for setting the stage. And what you might have heard from Lucy is we were very intentional to include really the sort of traditional players in the power infrastructure and all things entrepreneurship, and certainly those that might not have been in that traditional infrastructure as well, to be as inclusive as possible. What I want to turn to next is she mentioned our sort of geographical perspective, and I want to give members from the team who spent times in the respective states just maybe 90 seconds, 2 minutes of popcorn style to just share what highlights, what stood out to them the most from the tour. And we're going to start in Iowa. So Damon, I'm going to toss it over to you. And then Lucy, you can certainly chime in as well. But when you reflect back on your time throughout the state of Iowa, what stands out the most to you?
Yeah, thanks, Dennis. And it's just great to be with everyone. Thanks for joining. What I'm reflecting on this morning is some of the classic questions around, why, what, how, and who. And I think that there was such a hospitality that we experienced, and such a hunger for connection, best practices. And I think that really speaks to what I would call like the how else. Like they've tried lots of things. They're really clear on their why. They're pretty clear on the what, actually, but the how and the who and the so how else, who else, really is percolating for me this morning with my coffee. And so I think that that's what's on my mind is that they seemed very curious. They seem really clear on their why. They seem really pretty clear on their what, but they're just hungry and hospitable for new ways and new people to be involved in the challenge.
Thank you, Damon. Lucy, anything you might add from your experience in Iowa?
Sure. Yeah, so I felt, looking back, I'm really grateful to have gone on the tour. I think it helped contextualize our work for me. And I think we cared a lot about the work before we went on the tour, and then coming back, we care about it tenfold because we actually heard from people how they're feeling and the need for this kind of conversation. One thing that stood out to me is that the most frequently cited the kind of need or aspiration from communities, more than money or resources or even education, was community support and mindset. So like, how do we foster community involvement and alignment and vision? How do we appreciate what we already have and then be optimistic about what we have yet to build? How do we embrace change and manage fear and those kinds of things? So mindset was really elevated. And one more note, I just thought that these things were really, it became clear how adaptive this work is. It's very human and habit and values based. So we're excited to be working on it.
Thanks, Lucy. Raquel, I'm curious how your experience in Missouri might compare and contrast to what you heard Damon and Lucy say in Iowa.
Sure. Yeah, good morning, everyone. I got to spend time in Missouri with a couple of other colleagues, and it was a fantastic trip, actually. We were looking forward to it and came back even more excited that we had been. Something that Damon and Lucy both mentioned was this aspect of curiosity, and that was certainly experienced by the communities and the individuals in Missouri. I was also really struck by the diversity of the state, maybe just geographically. In terms, we experienced a sultry day, a little hot and humid, and the next morning we were in southern Missouri, and northern Missouri the next day or two, there was snow blowing, and, typical, it felt like Kansas in a way, but I was really struck by how different the state felt from, the southern border to near the northern border. The relationships and partnerships that exist in communities that we visited really stood out to me. And it may be because I'm constantly thinking about relationships and partnerships as part of my work at KLC. But I noticed that and thought that that was a really critical piece. And then the thing that maybe the last thing I'll mention is and again, this is I have the perspective of having been an elected official and done economic development in that work. And I was surprised by how few local elected officials I saw in these community meetings. And I thought that there might be a bigger turnout for that. And I don't know, it has me curious about that.
Yeah, interesting. Raquel, makes us contemplate what is the role of authority as it relates to building these entrepreneurial ecosystems. Brandon, Claudia, you both facilitated some sessions across the state of Kansas. What would you say about your time?
Good morning, Dennis. Good morning, everyone. Well, I did facilitate some sessions in Spanish. So something that I would like to share, or something that really surprised me, was how disconnected some Latino communities in those different rural areas feel from, not only from other Latinos in the state, but from the state itself, from what we have in Kansas, what resources we have. Sometimes they're looking for resources on neighboring states, especially those rural areas that live in border cities or towns. And then I echo what Damon was saying also, like that hunger for, in this case, they really were excited to receive people who spoke the same language. So they're hungry for like sessions in Spanish and information in Spanish with some cultural appealing to them. So they were really excited to receive us and then talk to us.
Thank you, Claudia. And we're going to talk a little bit more about, we were very intentional on this tour. In fact, it was critical to ensure that we engaged non-English speaking communities and to glean observations of just their experience as it relates to entrepreneurship in rural Midwest. And Alejandro is going to help us learn a little bit more about that in Nebraska in just a moment. But Brandon, over to you. Tell me about what your reflections and your highlights were across the state of Kansas.
Yeah, thank you, Dennis. And yeah, I think, some of the things that have already been surfaced, I think have been on my mind. Claudia's point, I think, really resonated with me when we think about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. I think this also connects to the point that Lucy made around mindset. One of the things that I've been reflecting a lot on is that it seemed that there's a lot of energy in these communities, that the communities had the ingredients and were doing important work. And one of the things that participants seemed to continually express was, we need different types of partnerships, and that partnership building and connections are difficult work. And asking, how do we do it? How do we work across factions? How do we build partnerships? How we build coalitions? And so this idea of mindset and partnerships was something that really stood out to me. And the second thing that I think stood out to me that I was really, I don't know if I was surprised about, but it really stood out, is how many communities that I visited was that they were doing kind of community development and entrepreneurial ecosystem building through the lens of arts, right? And so like quite a few of the communities we went to had murals, or they had special events that maybe with music that tried to draw people to business districts. And I think that was never spoken. No one ever said like, we use the arts to try to drive activity and commerce, but it was apparent because when you walk down the streets, you could see, paintings, music, festivals. And I think that's something that I was curious about and wondered, what's the role of the arts in civic life and entrepreneurial ecosystem building?
Thank you, Brandon. Hey, Alejandro, why don't you round out this segment for us, and not only just your experience across Nebraska, but maybe even specifically what you gleaned from some of the non-English speaking sessions that you facilitated, I believe in was it Norfolk and Grand Island?
That's right. And as I learned, it's not Norfolk, it's Norfolk. Oh, okay. So just FYI. But thank you so much, Dennis, for that. And I do want to echo one thing, and that's Raquel's a conversation about weather, right? Because I traveled to all four corners of Nebraska, and I did not realize Nebraska was that big. It's a huge state. But I got to travel with Julia, and we had an amazing time. And the first thing I do want to reflect on is that the biggest highlight for me was the success looks different from community to community. right? Not everybody wants to be Omaha, and not everybody wants to be Lincoln. They want to grow within their city limits, and they want to thrive within those city limits. Like, they want to keep the small town feel, but with thriving community. And I thought that was one of the most like eye-opening statements for me, because I went in thinking we all want to be the next New York, or we all want to be the next Pittsburgh, or whatever it may be. But they were like, no, not really. We want to grow within, and we want to be able to take advantage of the things we have. And it's sort of thinking about the Spanish sessions, although I did learn a lot, I think it's like the lag in communication creates such a huge knowledge gap. And I think that's what halts the progress. And that's what people were saying, because the biggest example that I have is somebody mentioned, oh, when we hear about grants, or when we hear about loans, or when we hear about resources, it's always in past tense. It's always, you should have applied for this grant, or you should have applied for this loan. But how were they supposed to know? So that was one of my biggest takeaways too, but also reflecting on one of my English sessions that Julia facilitated, we asked those folks, who's missing in this room? And that was a pretty common question across the board for most of us in our facilitation. But people spent like 5 minutes naming the traditional stakeholders until somebody went, we are missing our Spanish-speaking community. Like, we actually have a family here, or a few families that own like 4 or 5 businesses, and they're not in this room. So those folks are thinking about this, and they are thinking about how diversity plays a role in this. But I do want to leave you with one last quote that I heard. I think it was in O'Neill. Somebody said, a diversity quota will not do. Intentionality will. So it's being intentional about the way that you approach folks, not with a number in mind, not saying we want the Hispanic community in there, but wanting them to be there, and them wanting to be there too. So that was one of my biggest reflections there.
Oh, thanks, Alejandro. Incredibly powerful. And I think what I'm hearing you and both Claudia say is there's a desire amongst these communities to strive for greater intentionality and meet folks where they are, right? So that we can hopefully mitigate some of those cultural and language barriers. Okay, with that, Sam, we'll check in with you. Is there any sort of comments or anything you're seeing come through the chat on any of our live streams that might be relevant to this first segment where we're talking about our reflections in the respective states throughout the Midwest?
Yeah, thanks, Dennis. So far, not too many comments, just people introducing themselves, saying hi. We have a really attentive audience of about 60 attendants on our 2 channels. So I think people are just eager to hear more.
Awesome. Well, welcome again to everybody. Thank you for joining us. Top of the morning, right, to you. And please, I hope you've joined us with a tall glass of coffee. All right, so I want to sort of zoom out now a little bit and maybe take a bigger thematic view of the Heartland region where we spent this time. And we'll just have the group sort of chat about this. And before we get to maybe some explicit themes that we drew from our analysis, I do want to hear you each speak a little bit more, maybe explicitly about the concerns and aspirations you heard across these communities, right? A common conversation starter for us is this gap exercise, right? And learning what people are really striving for, their concerns, and what makes it difficult to get from one end to the other. So with that, I'll open it up and I just want to hear, what did you think about the concerns and aspirations throughout the Heartland region?
Well, go ahead, Damon.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I was just going to start the conversation off by talking about a conversation we had. I think, gosh, it might have been in Joplin. And we asked, if you got it right here, what would that look like? Tell us about that. And interestingly, that community was thinking about bits and pieces from other small towns and large cities from all across the country that they are looking to as inspiration. And they said, there's no one place that has it exactly right. We want to draw from other resources, other communities, other ideas. And I think what the message behind that was, when the vision isn't exactly clear, it isn't completely spelled out, sometimes that's challenging to get people on board because not everybody is a visionary thinker. And so how do you bring people along when they're not visionary thinkers? and they need it all laid out. And sometimes that can be a challenge in communities.
I think that also resonates in Nebraska quite a bit. And it's this whole mindset of it's always like the same 7 folks attending every meeting. And that causes obviously naturally burnout, right? But it's them fighting against the naysayers, right? But that group of folks, those 7 folks, also tend to not invite those naysayers into the conversation, because the last thing you want to hear is somebody disagreeing with you, right? And I think if we think in the way that like KLC works, is we always focus on engaging new voices, but those 2 factions are never speaking to each other. Like they're always disagreeing. And it also speaks to like in a smaller town, and some of the towns that I visited were like very, very small, hearsay is one of the most powerful deterrents of entrepreneurship. Like if one neighbor doesn't like you and that neighbor says something, bad about your business, it's like a trickle effect, right? So it's like this whole concept of just being able to speak with each other. I think that's one thing that came up a bunch of times in Nebraska.
Yeah, I really appreciate that perspective, Alejandro, because I think that was a common theme in the sessions I facilitated as well. And it made me think as well, there was kind of competing interpretations of that phenomenon of what do we do with naysayers and mindset and coalition building. And, one interpretation where participants seemed to go was, how do we get everyone on the quote unquote same page, or how do we get, everyone, moving in the same direction, was the type of language that some folks highlighted. And then there's others that I think maybe aligns more with an adaptive interpretation, where how do we hold all of those perspectives together in productive disagreement? And I personally, walked away from these listening sessions thinking that might be a more healthy path from the perspective of ecosystem building and civic life, is that we need communities that are prepared to productively disagree about the future trajectory of their town. And how do we equip ecosystems with those skills to disagree productively, to manage risk, to be able to overcome naysayers and critique, because there's something there when quote unquote naysayers are at the table, they represent a faction that if accounted for, might be useful in making progress in the community. And I think that to me really represents some energy around, some training or maybe some thinking around how do we equip ecosystems to productively disagree about the future of their towns and communities.
Yeah, I want to keep building on that. And I think if there was like a continuum of like where mindsets change, and then there's a real recognition of the skills and capacities that need to be taught. I think the 2 from our framework that popped for me were choosing between competing values and working across factions. Like these 2, I really appreciated what Alejandro said about they don't want to be another community. They've chose between competing values. They could go move somewhere else, many of them, and they've chosen to be there, and they like the things about their community. And so in that way, then there's another continuum, right? Like maybe around decline, normalcy, and prosperity. And so those who are wanting to push into prosperity, it's going to require more people. And so then you have to work across factions. And that's a skill that you can learn. Speaking as someone who's done community development in a small town of 2,000 before, that's a skill I had to learn. And it was painful because it's exactly what you said around like that vision, but you have to hold that vision loosely and allow other people to contribute to it. And so the very thing that you're upset about, you're contributing to. And what a difficult conundrum to be in. And so that's where mindset and skill kind of smash up against each other. And I hope an area where we can be really helpful in the future.
One of the participants in one of the communities that I visited, her concern was the lack of support and trust from the community. And the conversation percolated a little bit around that subject until somebody was like, they were trying to figure out like, how do we get trust from the community? How do we get support? Because if I feel like they're like consumers trust more like national brands or like, big companies instead of like the small businesses. And then suddenly one girl was like, wait a minute, but what about licenses and permits? What licenses do we need? And they were like, we have no clue what type of licenses do we need. And after she came up with that question, it was a lot of like conversation around, yeah, a lot of us understand English and can hold a conversation, but we will feel more comfortable in some information was in Spanish for us. Because that, like, starting a business is a big decision and want to make sure that we understand everything that's going on. And they felt like there was a lack of education, training, coaching in Spanish, of things that they didn't know. And one of the things that resulted on that conversation that I feel like it does not only apply to Latinos, but also to new people who move to the state or to that area, is like how patient are we on like holding somebody, like telling somebody how the things work, because things change in every state and every town. People do things differently. And this is something that is huge for the Latino community, because a lot of them are newcomers who either come from another country or from another state, and they just don't understand how things work on those small towns or cities.
Well, what's really interesting about that, Claudia, is that so like now we're sort of talking about like technical solutions, right? Like we tell folks where to go. And that came up in all of our conversations, because anytime that they get invited to a workshop or anytime that they get invited to anything that has to do with education about their business, it's usually they come and they learn something technical, right? And I felt a huge craving in the Hispanic community, and specifically in the Spanish-speaking Hispanic community, of saying like, I want to learn how to charge for my services. Like I cannot compete with a big national brand, but like how much do I charge? I want to learn how to do proper accounting. Like tax season is a huge barrier for us, specifically in small towns and as a business owner. The question even came up of like not knowing the laws in Nebraska as far as selling alcohol, right? Like there's very specific laws about that they were not aware when they were opening their business. So it's like, it makes me wonder, like, what's that pipeline of information, and how do we as the KOC and our job and our role in this, how do we facilitate that? Like we can work on the adaptive issues, forever, but we can do this for a long time. But maybe our mindset also has to change and think more, this is a community where economic developers are not in. Like they're going to attend our English sessions, right? So for our Spanish-speaking communities, like how do we bring them information that they want and information that we believe that they need? And like we believe they need adaptive leadership, right? But they also want technical solutions. So how do we bring both?
And in a timely manner, Alejandro, because if you remember in one of the cities that we visited, one of the concerns was that the communication from top down didn't get on time, like what you guys said, like once they get it, it's already past tense, or the information is not usable anymore.
And what this has me thinking about is there may be a number of technical solutions out there for specific things that need technical solutions. But even just like in the examples Claudia and Alejandro are talking about, there's something adaptive underneath all of that. And what are those barriers? And how do we get, how do communities get to a place where they understand what those barriers are, those true underlying barriers? Because it's probably not really about communication, but what is it about? And I don't know, that feels like super important work for all of us to be thinking about as we think about next phases. But it's about helping communities and community members understand what's underneath the technical things that keep popping up.
Yeah, I appreciate that observation, Raquel. And I think the conversation that Claudia and Alejandro are having, I think aligns with some of the themes that I heard in Kansas. And my interpretation of it was that it's maybe a question of diagnosis, right? That there are some technical challenges and some adaptive challenges, but that the communities were communicating that they need solutions and structures that allow them to have better diagnosis of those distinctions. And I think, the challenge of ecosystem building is that it's extremely complex. And how do we equip individuals, organizations, and systems to do better diagnosis of where they're at in the system. And I think that to me was a crux that I heard in many of the Kansas sessions as well. So I appreciate elevating that perspective.
One more thing connected to what Raquel said. So I think, Raquel, as we went on our tour in Iowa, we thought a lot about this question too. It's not just about kind of a technical sense of communication, but so it's about language, but it's also about culture. And it's about bringing populations to, not about one population moving all the way to understanding and doing all of the work, but rather multiple populations kind of meeting in the middle and understanding one another. So one thing we walked away thinking about is how do we equip, for example, the people who have already been in the town for a while and maybe are perhaps the more usual voices. What kinds of supports do they need versus newer populations coming in, maybe more diverse populations coming in, just acknowledging that these are two or more than two different sets of people we're working with, and they're going to require their own support systems to help them bridge the gaps between one another.
One last thing I would say is the not knowing what the resources are and the communication attached to that isn't just a challenge for the Hispanic community, because we were in communities in Missouri where there isn't much diversity, and that same message came up. So there's it's not a it spans communities and races, and whether you've been in the work for a long time or you're brand new to it, or this community is new to you, or you grew up here, this issue just pervades, all boundaries.
Great discussion. Brandon, Damon, I kind of wanted to come back to the two of you to start this next piece off. The connection between entrepreneurial ecosystem building and what we might just largely refer to as community development, right? And I think I had the opportunity, Brandon, to join you and Lucy on a couple stops and throughout Kansas. And what I heard, as Alejandro mentioned, the success was uniquely defined by each community. There was some consistency to the aspirations. And to Raquel's point, it was, if you get these things right, what would it yield? And I heard some of the same things in, say, Independence that I heard in Hutch and Dodge, right? That we would, it would yield talent, more talent retention and attraction. It would yield affordable housing. It would yield walkable cities. You'd see your neighbor at the Main Street Fair. And maybe some of that seems somewhat obvious, but getting entrepreneurial ecosystem building right can be critical to enhancing community development. What did the two of you see in your work?
What I think I'm reflecting on, I'm going back to this word mindsets because it came up in all four of our stops, and I'm hearing that it came up in other places. And I don't remember, I think it was Claudia that said, it's not just enough to or maybe actually, I think it was Alejandro around, it's not a quota. So when I reflect on the word ecosystem, an ecosystem is interdependent. The entire ecosystem will fail if one part fails. And it's got me curious about how that mindset of, it's not just an empathetic, in that the road of an entrepreneur might be different based on background of generation or cultural background or race or many factors. So that the 10 steps of the entrepreneurial are going to look slightly different based on what stage or what background. But it's about empathy and interconnectedness. And if, the buzzword for the trip, of course, was inclusive prosperity. So I think about this word of inclusive prosperity and interdependence of an ecosystem. And I think that's a mindset. Those words weren't used in Iowa that I heard, but that's the heart's cry, if you will. And to Raquel's point, that's what's underneath. There's a lot of technical solutions to build bridges, but beneath that, there's a basic, not just like, oh, we're being inclusive, right? Because we're checking a lot of boxes, but like we need each other, and can you guys sense the difference of around just like we are interdependent with one another? And that's got me curious about that in terms of ecosystem building.
Thanks, Damon. Brandon?
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Damon. And I think that, aligns with some of the themes that I've been thinking about through my visits in Kansas, and this theme of interdependence and ecosystems, because, I would also say in the meetings I facilitated, no one explicitly said those words, but what they were highlighting was, hey, there's these things that happen in our community relationally through people and through the space of our community that sets the conditions for entrepreneurial activity. People talked a lot about like parks. They talked about art. They talked about quality of place. They talked about walkable downtown districts. They talked about like access to childcare, access to affordable housing. And I think, what's powerful about this relationship between community development and entrepreneurial ecosystems is that it's truly recognizing the systems level connections between all of these factors. And I think the communities that I visited and could tell had a lot of energy around this, they had people trying to make those connections, right? Like, and I think that might be, in my mind, a takeaway that I had about the difference between like the individual activities of an individual entrepreneur, right? Like starting a new business versus a community saying, we want to support entrepreneurial activity in this community. And that's a little bit broader of an activity and requires a different approach and different kind of contributions. And so for me, I think I walked away with this thinking, if we're interested in entrepreneurial ecosystem building, we also acknowledge those aspects of civic life that we're hoping for. And I think the communities that are aspiring towards like what they say is vibrancy, like I heard that word a lot, like we want to have a vibrant community. They included both kind of entrepreneurial ecosystem questions and civic life, like how do we live well together? How do we connect to our neighbors? How do we ensure people have good jobs and feel connected to this community? And I think that's the adaptive challenge, is connecting those two kind of approaches and systems. And I think that's the takeaway that I heard around some of this relationship between ecosystem and community development.
No, well said.
Dennis,
go ahead.
And I would like to add that you mentioned talent retention. That's something that came out pretty strong in liberal Kansas. It's in a community where the Latino population is over 70%. The big concern was like, okay, our young talent, our young kids who are fully bilingual, they're leaving, to go to college, and then they just don't come back. And they were concerned about the quality of the communication tools. They were talking that it's not enough to just have a bilingual person or a bilingual flyer, but have top quality communication with them and people who can actually build trust with the community through that communication.
Thank you. Now, great insights from Liberal for sure, and one of the really rare and unique communities that we had an opportunity to visit. Lucy, I want to come back to you. Alejandro, did you have something you want to add?
Go ahead.
Okay, no, thanks. Lucy, you had the sort of the heavy lifting job of really aggregating a lot of what we heard from across these 4 states into some of these thematic issues. We've talked a lot thus far, probably about what I think we maybe all agree on is sort of one of the leading themes, right? This issue of community mindset, involvement, and collaboration. As we get into the last segment of our time together, what's another theme that you might lift up to continue our conversation, or something else in addition to that mindset vibe that carried a lot of concern across these communities?
Yeah, and I've been meaning to kind of preview that we do have a draft report that will be coming out, I think in the next few weeks, that kind of lists all of these themes. And I do feel that our conversation today has touched on the ones that at least I heard the most on my leg of the tour. So we've touched on the need for education programs to promote entrepreneurship. We've touched on the need for quality of life so that people come and stay in these communities and the challenge around building that. We've touched on the awareness of resources and how that seems to be a challenge everywhere. So this communication challenge. mindset and narrative. But what have we, and one other is just recruiting and engaging youth. That was another topic that came up a lot. I'd be curious to hear from others too, if there was anything that we think we all have this report, so we might be able to pull from it. Let me see. Maybe just a few things under mindset and narrative in case we haven't touched on them. So it's wanting to move away from the status quo and the idea that nothing's going to change, and the idea that we should just keep thinking within the box, and rather moving towards appreciation of and education on why entrepreneurship is important and critical to thriving in the community, keeping change alive, I versus we mentality. So moving to more towards kind of a collective mentality.
No, thank you, Lucia. And I think that the point to be underscored there is this is clearly an incredibly nuanced and complex topic, and we barely just scratched the surface with some of like the top 2 or 3 themes that we witnessed from across the Heartland. As we start to wind down the hour, I do want to check in with Sam to gauge some comments or questions from those watching this morning to see if we can't field 1 or 2 at this time.
Yes, thanks, Dennis. I'll read out some comments and then I'll end with the questions that might be addressed. Kari Jackson Mayu says, good morning. Raquel and Alejandro's comments really resonate with me about some of the experience we've had in Reno County, Kansas. Something I am working on is what Arthur Brooks says, we don't need to disagree less, we need to disagree better. Forrest Hirschberger on YouTube says, sometimes the cultural barrier is just as important as the language, who to talk to, who are the influencers in a community, how do you become part of the community while developing a business. Ernesto de la Rosa says, besides the basic knowledge with immigrant business owners, i.e. taxing, marketing, etc., there is also a fear barrier and a lack of knowledge when it comes to grant and incentive opportunities being offered in their own communities and at the state level. We saw this occurring during the COVID-19 pandemic. A couple as for questions, Imogene Harris asks, was there any facilitated connection between the English and Spanish speaking groups in the same communities? We might answer that. Another question to answer was Mike Miller's, how do we recognize an attempt might fail? How do we evaluate and move on to what is next?
Thanks, Sam. Go ahead.
To answer that question, I think that the session that we did in Liberal, Kansas was pretty much bilingual. All of the attendants had Latino roots, but some of them were really connected with the non-English speaking community, while others were more connected with the English speaking community. So that was a great conversation with like a lot of different perspectives. I don't know if you agree with that, Alejandro.
I do, and we did have fun in Dodge City. We had a full English session in one room, but then the Spanish session turned into a bit of Spanglish. So it also became a little more bilingual, and it was kind of interesting because we had a set of parents and their daughter in the audience. Like they were arguing among themselves, like about, you know, that big generational divide about entrepreneurship. So that was really cool. But yeah, so I guess technically we had to.
Thank you both. Okay, as we head into what is just our last 10 minutes remaining, I do want to get to, you know, our sweet spot here at the Leadership Center, right? What is really the intersection of, you know, we've done some maybe preliminary diagnosis here. We've identified adaptive challenges and certainly no community is without technical issues as well. But when we think about, you know, what kind of leadership is going to be necessary to make progress on entrepreneurial ecosystem building and our principles and our framework, I'd love to hear from the group. And Raquel, we might start with you. What stands out amongst our framework or principles of really key exercises in leadership that folks in these communities might need to exercise to make progress?
Well, what I would say actually connects to the question Mike Miller had about how do you know when something isn't working and when to when you stop and move on. And that ties back to what KLC believes about being experimental or having an experimental mindset. And I think that's especially challenging in economic development because you don't bring ideas, you don't bring half-baked ideas or half-baked strategies to the table in economic development, because I don't think people have a taste for that or a tolerance for that. And so I think communities making that shift to be more experimental and less certain about the things they're going to, pursue or put dollars to, or, whatever, especially tax dollars. I don't know. I think that's becoming more experimental, and developing that mindset is probably a really critical piece in this work moving forward.
Brandon, I'd love to get your take in terms of the adaptive leadership necessary here.
Yeah, of course. I think the one thing that I'm walking away with thinking about is the idea of working across factions. So one of the things that it seems like I heard a lot at the listening sessions is that there's a ton of energy in these communities, and and folks are extremely passionate about the success of their communities. But one of the things I kind of noticed is that sometimes it seemed that people were gravitating to like-minded groups, right? Like people that kind of all shared similar assumptions about the future. And I think what might take ecosystem building to the next level is increasing the capacity of communities to work across factions and have a healthy level of disagreement. And I don't necessarily know what that explicitly looks like or what the level is, but going to Raquel's point is I think that's going to take some experimentation. And so I think for me, that's something I hope to explore in the future, and I hope to see and think about that kind of leadership aspect moving forward. But thanks for the question.
Yeah, no, thanks. And to your point, it seems like uncertainty and conflict are almost two consistent variables in ecosystem building, and how do communities get comfortable weathering and navigating that on a consistent basis. Other thoughts on the intersection of leadership and what kinds of leadership it's going to take to cultivate thriving entrepreneurial communities?
Well, Dennis, I want to comment on something you just said about uncertainty and conflict. That's not something we should be shying away from, but it's adjusting our mindset to what conflict means, and that it's productive heat or productive energy. And instead of shying away from conflict, shift our thinking about it and use conflict as a motivator in a community. If things aren't cooking, if things aren't progressing, then that means there's no conflict in the system. There's no heat in the system. And we have to have that. And communities need that and want that. They just don't know they want it yet because they think of conflict as, fighting and angst and, hurting people and, things of that nature. So I'm pushing back on the conflict comment, I guess.
and I think that's particularly hard in a small town, because you're interacting with one another in Boy Scouts and in 4-H and in all the activities, and so there's a level of Midwestern heartland niceness that we all possess, and that's a great virtue, I think. But then it makes it hard to do this work around healthy conflict and leaning into uncertainty and celebrating failure. Think about the risk of an entrepreneur, social entrepreneur, economic entrepreneur in a small town. If they do something and it fails, that'll stay with them for 10 or 20 years. That's right. Oh, that's, Bob who tried that thing, it didn't work, and so I go back to this word celebration, like the celebration of these communities and the celebration of like, imagine an incubator in a small town, a strip center, that said, or Main Street that said, we love conflict and uncertainty and failure, and it was warm and it was open to all, which highlights something that I think is another competency, which would be to build a trustworthy process. I think I would just add that one in the mix, that I think that's going to be really important, that a trustworthy process be baked into our potential solutions.
Dennis, you and Brandon talked a little bit about diagnosis. I think we have to be a little bit more intentional on understanding that even though we have really good thriving communities or thriving business owners, I think what Damon mentioned earlier, be mindful that we are an ecosystem and understanding that we're still in diagnosis. I will say, I want to really say that we need to be taking the temperature more often and making sure that everybody, like, especially with the Latino community, it's not just enough to be like, okay, we're just gonna do flyers in Spanish, here you go, but making sure and taking the temperature that everybody is involved in the process or understanding the process.
There's something also there about giving the work back, right? I feel like a lot of those folks that are working in these ecosystems and working with entrepreneurs tend to take all the work on themselves. So like I said, like those 7 folks that attend every meeting tend to do everything, and it causes burnout. We did have a chat, and I can't remember which part of Nebraska I was in, but somebody said that it's hard to dream when you've been dreaming for 15 years and you've been doing the same thing for 15 years, and there's the same meeting for 15 years. So like somebody pitched the idea, like we need new voices, like we have to bring in new voices because we need new ideas because times have changed. It's not 15 years ago anymore. It's not 2007. So somebody said, like, we have to get more younger folks in here, which then that talks about working across generational factions and then engaging those new voices as well. So there's something about giving the work back that is really important that I think a lot of people are afraid to talk about.
That's a great note to start our conclusion with, Alejandro. Thank you. Sam, I want to toss it back over to you because you have a related comment about working across factions that you wanted to share with the group before we wrap up this morning.
Yes, and also a question that just came in. This just in, as they say. Shane Iwashige said, I love the collective mentality point. One of the things that could help reshape this conversation is rethinking what collaboration between for-profit and nonprofit organizations look like. Often we're working on the same problems, and if we could better utilize our specific tools, both sectors could make progress. To me, that is just a specific instance of work and working across factions. Brent Lewis asked, what conversations are taking place about the workforce necessary to support an entrepreneurial ecosystem? Are the skills and culture required to support entrepreneurial ventures being developed?
Yeah, what a powerful question. I'll just go back to Lucy made a point. One of the themes we heard consistently throughout the community is what are we doing to empower, cultivate, educate youth across these communities, knowing that they are inherently the future of entrepreneurial ecosystem building. Lucy, anything you might want to add to that?
Honestly, just that was such a prevalent theme that I feel like we almost didn't talk about it because we heard it so much that we maybe assume like we all know it. It came up a lot.
On that, Lucy, I might actually have you give us a couple last words, just like sort of tactically where we might be going next. You mentioned a report that we're going to publish. Optimism around our continued work with Kauffman and what that might mean to some of the communities viewing today.
Yeah, I think just be on the lookout for this report coming, and we'd love to see people get creative about how they use the report to further diagnose in their communities what's going on and the kinds of interventions that might be helpful. Feedback to us about other things we should know and haven't maybe talked about. And also just be on the lookout for further opportunities to partner with us. We are hoping to develop interventions, like I said, regionally associated with these themes and goals. Be on the lookout.
Thank you very much, Lucy. It is 8:59 a.m. I want to thank everybody for joining us this morning. And just one last plug, if you will. Please join us again on June 22nd at noon for our next Journal Live event, where we're going to continue our discussion around all things entrepreneurship and ecosystem building, specifically around what is right with Ord, Nebraska. So join Chris Green and the group at noon on June 22nd. You can find details for that on our website or across any of our social media platforms as well. A huge thanks to all my friends and our team joining us this morning. Really appreciate the insight, and it was critical and important for us to convene this sharing component of a listening session, right? An important part of listening is sharing, and I appreciate all of your commitment to that today. Also, one point of gratitude to Network Kansas again for facilitating our relationships across the 4-state area. Heartfelt gratitude to the Kauffman Foundation for the funding of this work. And to all of you joining us this morning via live stream, thank you for your contributions. And we're excited to see you again shortly. Onward. Bye all.